Silence swallows the Galactic Senate. On the central hologram, a single human stands against the star-streaked wreckage of a siege. Ambassador Elias Vance speaks, and his question echoes through the chamber. The Verex Armada claims this sector by right of conquest, but humanity asks, by what right do they claim the lives of billions? That moment of defiance ignited the political earthquake that would rock the foundations of galactic power. You will discover the incredible true story of how humanity went from overlooked newcomers to leading the entire galaxy, a tale of crisis, cunning, and a courage that shattered 1,000,000 years of tradition. What began with a question would end with a human taking the oath of office. But how did such an impossible idea ever become reality, and what shocking secret nearly destroyed it before it began? What does it truly take to unite a galaxy that has forgotten how to trust? The question hung in the air, a challenge to 10,000 years of galactic order. For weeks, the political fallout was immense, yet nothing truly changed. The old powers, the Verex and their allies, dismissed it as human emotionalism, a fleeting spectacle. The bureaucratic machinery of the Senate, vast and slow, simply absorbed the shock and kept grinding along. Then, during what should have been a mundane session debating mining rights in the neutral asteroid belts of the Cygnus sector, history detonated. The Thulian Chancellor, Kalan, a being whose carapace was etched with the rings of centuries, rose from his podium. His voice, usually a dry whisper of procedure, carried a new and startling weight. He interrupted a tedious speech on crystalline ore taxation, and with a gesture that silenced the chamber, he said the words no one expected. He nominated Ambassador Elias Vance for the vacant presidency of the Galactic Senate. His reasoning was a laser cut through the fog of tradition. He cited not human strength or wealth, but what he called a perspective forged in crisis that we lack. He spoke of the siege of Vega Prime, of watching a species with no fleet and no allies choose a question over a surrender. They saw a problem we refused to acknowledge, he stated. They asked why when we only ask how much. In that moment, he was not nominating a human. He was nominating the principle of defiance against fatalism. Vance was visibly stunned. From his observer's gallery, not even a full member's seat, he stood and immediately refused. "I represent one species among thousands," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "This is not our way. We are newcomers. This honor, this duty belongs to those with deeper roots." It was a textbook response of humility, the correct political move. And it was utterly ignored. For the first time in living memory, a wave of sound began not from the central core worlds, but from the periphery. A low hum built from the tiers representing the minor species, the fledgling coalitions, the planets forever on the agenda but never at the table. It was not a coordinated cheer, but a rising chorus of affirmation, a clatter of appendages and a flutter of membranes in their varied forms of assent. The camera drones panned across delegates from agricultural moons and trade consortiums, their expressions not of joy but of fierce, desperate hope. The discontent was no longer simmering, it had boiled over. Chancellor Kalan had not created a movement, he had given it a name and a face. The old guard was paralyzed. Procedural objections were shouted down. Calls for delay were met with outright refusal. The presiding officer, a Verex viceroy, looked out at a chamber suddenly and dangerously alive and saw the unthinkable, a genuine, spontaneous coalition forming before his eyes. With no protocol for this, no way to contain the energy, he was forced to call an emergency vote. The tally, displayed across the galactic network in real time, did not just shock the galaxy, it rewired its political consciousness. The human ambassador who had come to ask a single question was now the president-elect, but a vote is just a promise and the real crisis was only beginning. How do you lead those who voted for a symbol when the reality of power is a labyrinth of ancient rivalries and hidden knives? The galactic networks blazed with the impossible news, but inside the presidential spire, the reality was a chilling quiet. Elias Vance now held a title with no manual, presiding over a government designed for deliberation, not decision. His first true test arrived not with a declaration of war, but with a silent, spreading shadow. It was called the xenophage, a tailored bioweapon that ignored carbon-based life and instead devoured the crystalline photosynthetic structures of the herbax, a gentle species whose garden worlds were the breadbasket for a quarter of the galaxy. Famine, on a scale not seen since the founding of the Senate itself, began to bloom across star systems. In the Senate's Emergency Committee, the response was a masterpiece of institutional failure. Endless debates erupted over jurisdictional boundaries, lawful containment protocols, and the economic compensation for affected trade lanes. Holograms displayed dying world forests while delegates argued over procedural precedent. The gridlock was absolute, a perfect machine built to discuss a crisis until it was too late. President Vance watched this for precisely one session. Then he closed his official feed, turned to his small, trusted staff, and asked a single, terrifying question. Who do we know that has fought something like this before? The answer lay in humanity's own darkest chapter, the Martian Quarantine Wars. A century prior, a rogue terraforming pathogen had nearly scoured Mars clean, a conflict fought not with ships, but with sealed labs and sacrifice. The survivors of that horror, virologists who had learned to think like the weapons they fought, were not celebrated heroes. They were renegades living in self-imposed exile on isolated research stations, their methods deemed too ruthless, their ethics too gray for polite society. Vance opened a direct, encrypted channel. He transmitted the xenophage genetic data with no promises, no contracts, only a plea. They answered, not for the Senate, but for the echoes of their own past. 72 hours later, a data packet arrived on the president's private terminal. It was not a theory, not a proposal. It was a complete, functional counteragent, a viral key that would reprogram the xenophage to dismantle itself. The method was brutal in its elegance, using the weapon's own aggressive replication as its delivery system. When Vance presented this to the stunned Emergency Committee, the silence was broken by a Verex senator, his voice thick with moral outrage. You consulted the butchers of Mars. You used a weapon of war to craft a cure. The implication was clear. This was not leadership, it was contamination. Vance met the accusation without flinching. We used our history to save your future, he stated, his tone flat, final. The lesson of Mars was not in the weapon, but in the response. You debate the rules of the fire while the house burns. We have already felt the flames. Now, he continued, turning his gaze to the assembled delegates, the cure exists. The real question remains, who here has the courage to deliver it? The challenge hung in the air, a direct rebuke to their inaction. In that moment, the Herbax delegation, their representatives trembling with grief and fury, stood as one. They would take the cure, they would pilot the ships. The Kalan Concorde, led by Chancellor Kalan, immediately pledged their fastest courier vessels for the run through contested space. The gridlock shattered not by a vote, but by a simple, undeniable act of solution. Billions were saved, and across 1,000 minor worlds, a new message was whispered, a message more powerful than any political speech. When the old ways fail, the human does not wait, he acts. Vance had transformed from a symbolic president into a functional one, and in doing so, he forged his first true coalition not of obligation, but of gratitude and stark necessity. Yet this very success painted the brightest target on his back, for he had just proven the old powers were not merely slow, but obsolete. The silence after the xenophage cure was a fragile, temporary thing. The Verex Empire had watched its political dominance erode, its economic pressure fail, and now its attempt at biological coercion unraveled by human ingenuity. Humiliation for a warrior culture built on the perception of invincibility is an intolerable poison. Their response was not subtle. A formal ultimatum, broadcast on every official channel, arrived in the Senate chambers like a physical blow. The Verex Armada, mobilized at the strategic Andromeda Junction, demanded the immediate and unconditional cession of the Hyperion gateways. These were not mere jump points. They were the galactic equivalent of the Panama and Suez canals combined, the vital arteries controlling the flow of trade and military movement between three quadrants. The price for refusal was spelled out in chilling clarity: total, annihilating war. Panic, cold and immediate, gripped the Senate. The Grand Chamber, so recently a place of defiant hope, now echoed with the frantic calculations of fear. The Senate's own military advisor, General Vorlak of the Thulian Defense Legion, a being whose shell bore the scars of a dozen border skirmishes, delivered the grim assessment. His voice was heavy with resignation. "Our combined peacekeeping fleets," he stated, the holographic displays behind him showing pitifully small force projections, "are outnumbered by a factor of 5. Their new Dreadnought class alone outguns our heaviest cruisers. The math of survival," he concluded, "points to a single, bitter course: we must appease. We must cede the gateways." The word appeasement hung in the air, a ghost from 100 conquered species histories. It felt like the end of everything they had just begun to build. Then President Vance stepped to the central podium. There was no hologram of a distant siege behind him this time, only the live, anxious faces of the galaxy's representatives. He did not look at the tactical displays, he looked at them. "They do not want your gateways," he began, his voice calm, cutting through the static of fear. "They want your fear. The Verex feed on it. It is the fuel for their empire. I have stood on a world under their guns. I have seen the faces of their soldiers through the scope of a rifle. They bleed, they hesitate, they are not invincible. They are simply very, very good at making you believe they are." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the chamber. It was one thing to speak of principle during a humanitarian crisis, quite another to dismiss the largest war machine in known space. Vance continued, his tone shifting from defiance to cold, analytical precision. "But hope is not a strategy, so let us discuss their strategy." He gestured, and a new set of data streams marked with human military sigils overlaid the Senate's own displays. "For the past 6 months," he explained, "every Verex fleet movement past our border listening posts has been tracked by passive sensor arrays we deployed as observers. We did not intercept, we did not challenge, we simply watched and we listened." The central hologram zoomed in, not on a fleet, but on a single vessel, the Verex flagship, the Imperator's Wrath. The data was a mesmerizing dance of energy readings, shield harmonics, and power fluctuations. "And here," Vance said, highlighting a barely perceptible pulse in the shield matrix that coincided with the ship's main weapon charging sequence, "is their arrogance. To power their primary lance, they must momentarily shunt 19% of their forward shield energy to their reactors. For 0.73 seconds, a corridor less than 100 meters wide on their starboard bow is vulnerable. Not to a full broadside, but to a pinpoint strike." The chamber was utterly silent, the panic replaced by a stunned, electric focus. General Vorlak was leaning forward, his analytical mind racing over the data. Vance had done the impossible. He had not offered empty courage or demanded a blind sacrifice. He had transformed the debate. It was no longer a question of whether to fight, but how. He had turned an ultimatum of surrender into a complex, terrifying, but tangible tactical problem. The fear of the Verex fleet was suddenly compartmentalized, analyzable. It had a flaw, a crack in the armor. The discussion in the chamber shifted instantly. Delegates were no longer talking about giving up the gateways. They were arguing over fleet compositions, diversionary tactics, and which species' fast attack corvettes had the targeting computers precise enough to thread that 100-meter needle. Vance had given them not just a reason to fight, but a way to believe they could win. He had weaponized their hope, But one critical question remained: who would be brave enough or desperate enough to volunteer to fly that first suicidal strike, run into the teeth of the Imperator's wrath? The flaw in the armor was a theory, a sliver of data on a screen. Turning it into victory required a weapon the Verex had never accounted for, a human specialty: audacity. The plan was codenamed Operation Stalwart Defender. It was not a battle of annihilation, but of revelation. A coalition task force spearheaded by humanity's newest and quietest ships, the ghost-like Stiletto-class frigates, would not attack the Verex armada head-on. Instead, they would slip through the defensive perimeter using the very shield fluctuation Vance had identified, their hulls coated in sensor-absorbent material, running silent and dark. Their objective was not the bridge or the engines, it was the flagship's primary communications array. For 3 tense days, the galaxy held its breath. The Verex fleet loomed at the Andromeda Junction, a poised fist waiting to strike. The Senate's combined fleets maneuvered into a defensive formation, a clear and public show of defiance meant to draw every Verex sensor's gaze. It was a grand, terrifying distraction. Meanwhile, the 3 stiletto frigates, like shadows moving between streetlights, crept closer. "We have the window," came the terse, encrypted signal. The lead frigate, the Resolute, aligned its trajectory with that 100-meter corridor of vulnerability. For 0.73 seconds, as the Imperator's wrath powered its main weapon in a blatant show of force, the human ship was inside its shield bubble. It launched no missiles, it fired no lasers, it released a swarm of micro-drones, each no larger than a man's hand, designed to cling to the flagship's hull and crawl toward pre-mapped data conduits. The drones breached the system not through brute force hacking, but by mimicking the digital signature of routine maintenance traffic. For 12 hours, they listened and recorded, siphoning the raw, unfiltered command channel traffic of the Verex High Command. Then they broadcasted. They hijacked the flagship's own powerful transmitters and blasted the signal across every public and military frequency in the sector, an open channel to the entire galactic net. What the galaxy heard was not strategy but atrocity. In clear, chilling detail, they heard the Verex Emperor himself, his voice a guttural growl of impatience, issue a direct order. The Andromeda Junction civilian outpost, home to 37,000 souls from a dozen neutral species, was to be sterilized, glassed from orbit as a demonstration of resolve. The justification was cold efficiency to clear a tactical obstruction. The reaction was instantaneous and universal. Moral outrage, a powerful but often ignored force in galactic politics, became a tangible, seismic shock. The Verex Armada's cohesion shattered. Ship captains, their own crews now hearing the Emperor's genocidal intent, began to break formation. Some outright refused the order. Others powered down weapons systems, signaling non-compliance. The image of invincibility crumbled into a tableau of shame and mutiny. As the Verex fleet retreated in confused disarray, not pursued by a single shot, the Galactic Senator, a species of crystalline philosophers, rose in the Senate. His voice, usually a melodic chime, was hard and clear as diamond. "You did not fight them with greater firepower," he declared, his facets reflecting the chamber's light. "You fought them with greater truth. You showed their strength to be a hollow performance, and you showed us our own conscience. This," he said, gesturing not to the tactical displays but to President Vance, "is a new kind of strength." In that moment, the whispers about Vance's leadership ceased to be whispers. They became a roaring chorus of open advocacy. He had not just won a battle, he had redefined the rules of engagement. He proved that in a galaxy of superweapons and vast armadas, the most powerful force could be a single, undeniable truth, broadcast for all to hear. The human president was no longer an experiment. He was the architect of the galaxy's first moral victory. And that made the old powers, now humiliated and exposed, more dangerous than ever before. Truth is a powerful weapon, but it is also a fragile one. The old dynasties of the Senate had watched their influence crumble, first from moral defiance, then from tactical genius. They would not attack Vance on the battlefield of ideals or open war. They would strike in the arena they had controlled for millennia, the shadowy world of backroom deals and financial influence. The scandal broke with the polished precision of a surgical strike. Senator Dravos of the Corvusian hegemony, a being whose silver feathers seemed to reflect every light in the chamber without absorbing any warmth, stood before a packed Senate inquiry. With a theatrical flourish, he released a data slate containing what he called irrefutable evidence. The holograms flared to life, displaying complex financial trails. Funds, substantial funds traced to human corporate entities, had flowed into the private accounts of 17 minor delegates, all of whom had voted for key provisions in Vance's Reconstruction Act. The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous: bribery, the most ancient predictable sin of politics. A murmur of profound disappointment swept the chamber. Had the human experiment been just another corruption, merely a new face on an old game, the media networks seized on it, broadcasting the damning flows of credit with sensational graphics. The narrative was set, the fall of the idealistic president was at hand. Vance was summoned to the inquiry. He entered not with lawyers or a defensive entourage, but alone, carrying a simple data pad. Senator Dravos presented the evidence with a tone of sorrowful betrayal. "Can you explain these transactions, Mr. President, the funds from your people to these delegates?" The chamber held its breath, awaiting a denial, a legalistic dodge, an excuse. Vance did not blink. "I can explain them, Senator. I do not deny a single credit." The admission was so stark it caused a physical recoil in the audience. "But your investigation is incomplete," he continued, his voice rising, not in panic but in clear, ringing anger. "You call them bribes, I call them reparations. You trace the money to our corporations, but you did not trace it from where it came. These funds were diverted from the budgets of 3 human frontier colonies, colonies that right now are delaying new water reclamation plants and orbital hospitals. We pulled the credits from our own flesh and bone." He tapped his data pad, and a new set of records overlaid the financial trails. "Now trace them forward." The holograms zoomed, following the money past the delegates' accounts. The funds did not purchase luxury or power. They went directly to Kelvar construction guilds, to atmospheric processors, to rebuilding the dome cities on Viridia 3. The Kelvar were a silicoid species whose world had been devastated by crossfire during a Senate-sanctioned action against pirates a decade prior, a forgotten conflict. Your own sanctions, imposed after the conflict was deemed resolved, froze their planetary relief funds, Vance stated, his gaze locked on Dravos. Your bureaucracy declared their world stable. It was a tomb. My people looked at your ledgers and saw a moral debt your laws had written off, so we paid it. The audit you commissioned missed the source and the destination because you only looked for crime in the middle. The records of the diversion, the colonial budget votes, the Kelvar receipts, they are not hidden. They have been public in our open civic databases since the day they were authorized. We call it transparency. You seem to call it a scandal. The silence in the inquiry chamber was absolute. Senator Dravos stood frozen, his sleek presentation in ruins. He had tried to expose a hidden corruption, only to unveil a blinding, inconvenient honesty. The exposé did not tarnish Vance, it scorched the old guard. It painted a devastating picture, a Senate so enmeshed in its own cynical games that it could not recognize basic decency, an institution that hunted for secret bribes while willfully ignoring public suffering. The story that spread across the galaxy was not of human corruption, but of human recklessness, a shocking, almost naive willingness to break their own budgets to fix an old injustice everyone else had agreed to forget. In a single hearing, Vance reframed the entire moral compass of power. The question was no longer who had the most influence, but who was actually paying attention. The public reckoning had been building for months, a slow pressure cooker of outrage and hope. It could only be released in one arena, the Great Debate. Mandated by interstellar law for any contested presidency, it was broadcast live across 1 million networks watched by trillions. On one side of the vast circular stage stood Senator Dravos, his silver plumage immaculate, a living monument to the old order. On the other stood President Elias Vance, looking not like a galactic leader, but like a man who had just come from a long, difficult meeting. The moderator, an ancient AI with a neutral, synthesized voice, posed the first question. It was about the foundational principle of governance, tradition versus change. Senator Dravos spoke first, his voice a smooth, practiced river. He painted a picture of galactic civilization as a magnificent, ancient tree, its roots deep in the slow wisdom of millennia. "We did not build this Senate in a day or in a century," he intoned. Its procedures, its checks and balances were forged in the fires of forgotten wars to prevent rash action, to ensure stability above all. To abandon this for the frantic energy of a newcomer is not progress. It is adolescent rebellion. It risks everything we have preserved for 10,000 years. His words were comforting, a warm blanket of familiar fatalism for many core world viewers. Vance listened, his expression unreadable. When his turn came, he did not raise his voice. He simply leaned toward his microphone. "Your slow wisdom," he began, each word deliberate. "Watch the xenophage spread through the herbax gardens while you debated containment protocols. Your stability watched the Verex Armada mobilize and called it appeasement. What you call deep roots, Senator, look an awful lot like chains to those trapped beneath the canopy. Your stability is not peace, it is a cage, and humanity does not do well in cages." He paused, letting the stark imagery settle. "We offer something else, urgency. Not as panic, but as purpose. The understanding that a problem solved tomorrow is often a disaster that could have been prevented today." Dravos seized the opening, his eyes sharp. "Urgency," he countered, "is a cousin to recklessness, and we must speak of history. Your species' timeline is a scroll written in conflict, war after war, planet against itself. You bring this turbulent spirit to our quiet galaxy. Can we trust a fire to tend a garden?" The question was the trap the old god had waited for, the ultimate indictment of human nature. The cameras zoomed in on Vance's face. He did not flinch. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a painful truth. "You are correct, Senator. Our history is written in ash and blood. We have made horrors you have only read about in your ancient archives, but you have missed the point entirely. You have only studied peace. You inherited it, codified it, debated its nuances in safe halls. We had to fight for it. We had to crawl out of our own darkness, generation by generation, and choose to build something better. That is the difference. We do not see peace as a default setting. We see it as a daily, fragile achievement, and we will fight like hell to protect it because we know exactly what it costs to lose." The silence in the studio was absolute. Vance had not denied the accusation. He had transformed it into his greatest credential. He had reframed humanity's bloody past not as a shameful secret, but as a brutal, earned doctorate in the value of peace. The debate continued, but the pivot had occurred. Dravos spoke of regulatory frameworks and economic models. Vance spoke of water on Viridia 3 and the faces on the Andromeda outpost. One argued from the abstract principle of order, the other from the tangible reality of consequences. When the final signals ended, the analysts expected a slow shift in polling. They were wrong. The surge was immediate and tectonic, a seismic wave through the mid-tier species, the agricultural consortiums, the mining guilds, the worlds that lived in the shadow of the core's slow wisdom. Planetary polls on 100 industrial moons and fledgling democracies flashed green, tipping from cautious observation to fervent endorsement. For them, the debate was not about political theory. It was a choice between a custodian of a museum and a mechanic who rolls up his sleeves to fix a broken engine. They had seen the mechanic work. They knew the custodian would simply lock the door and post a sign. The scales of the galaxy, held in balance for so long by tradition and fear, finally, decisively tipped. But a vote of confidence is not a coronation, and the final, most solemn test of any president was still to come, waiting in the silent, sacred vaults of the Galactic Archive. The great debate was over, but the true cost of winning had yet to be collected. President Vance's victory tour was a necessity, a journey to the very worlds that had lifted him to power. His first stop was Vega Prime, the scarred planet where his single question had once echoed from the ruins. It was meant to be a powerful symbol, a closing of the circle. Instead, it nearly became his grave. The presidential shuttle, a sleek vessel of polished alloy and humming shields, descended through Vega Prime's toxic amber skies. Then, without warning, the primary thruster couplings sheared. Not from wear, not from accident. Forensic scans would later show microscopic fractures, the hallmarks of molecular stress induced by a tailored corrosive agent. Sabotage, the shuttle became a dead weight, tumbling through the acidic atmosphere, its hull screaming as it carved a fiery trench across a continent of crystalline badlands. The impact was catastrophic. The Senate, watching the live feed, saw the signal dissolve into static. For 6 agonizing hours, search probes scoured the crash site. They found twisted wreckage, environmental suits shredded by claw marks, not from the crash, but from something that hunted in the jagged forests. There were no life signs. In the Grand Chamber, a solemn silence descended. Senator Dravos, his features arranged in an expression of profound grief, addressed the assembly. "We have witnessed a tragedy," he intoned. The galaxy has lost a unique voice, but the work of governance cannot cease with one man. The Constitution is clear. After 48 hours of a president's incapacitation, the chair of the Oversight Committee assumes interim authority. That chair was his. His maneuvering was swift, clinical, and utterly predictable. He began drafting emergency orders to suspend the more aggressive reconstruction projects, citing a need for stability and review. He was not seizing power. He was gently, responsibly steering the ship back to its familiar, slow course. The galaxy mourned, and Dravos prepared to inherit a presidency he believed had been mercifully returned to its proper custodians. He was wrong. Deep in the violet jungles of Vega Prime, Elias Vance was alive. The crash had killed his pilot and most of his security detail. His sole companion was his diplomatic aide, an android designated Aiden, whose left leg was crushed and whose vocal processor spat static. Their shelter was the shuttle's cracked fuselage, already being eaten away by the planet's perpetual acid drizzle. Survival was a minute-by-minute calculus against the environment. The amber rains burned exposed skin. The local flora was predatory, vines that lashed out with bone-breaking force, spores that induced paralyzing hallucinations. Vance, using scavenged pieces of his own ruined environment suit and strips of insulation, sealed the worst leaks. Aiden, with relentless logic, catalogued their resources. They had a hand torch, a damaged med kit, and the shuttle's emergency beacon, its transmitter array smashed. For 2 days, they evaded the skittering predators that circled their makeshift shelter at night. Vance knew the Senate's protocol. They would presume him dead. Dravos would be moving. A functional distress signal might take weeks for a rescue ship to triangulate, and it would only save 2 lives. It would not save the presidency or the fragile coalition he had built. He looked at the shattered beacon, then at Aiden's sparking chassis. "We are not calling for help," he said, his voice raw from the acidic air. "We are sending a message." Using the hand torch and a shattered piece of viewport as a focusing lens, he and Aeon spent a day and a night performing brutal field surgery on the beacon. They bypassed its shattered main circuits, routing power directly from Aiden's own failing power cell through the android's secondary communication module. It was a jury-rigged monstrosity, a broadcast that would drain Aiden completely and likely burn out after one burst. but it would be powerful, raw, and unencrypted, screaming across every open channel in the sector. As a particularly violent acid storm lashed their shelter, Vance held the makeshift transmitter. He did not send coordinates. He did not plead for rescue. His voice, filtered through static and the howl of the wind, pierced the galactic ether. If this is the cost of change, I pay it willingly, but ask yourselves who benefits from silence. The transmission lasted 4.7 seconds. Then Aiden's systems went dark and the beacon melted into slag, but those 4.7 seconds traveled at the speed of light. The signal was first picked up by a freighter hauling ore from a nearby asteroid belt. The captain, a grizzled Tauran, immediately rebroadcasted. From there, it echoed. It jumped from civilian comms arrays to news networks, from mining outposts to the personal devices of senators in their luxurious quarters. The raw, undeniable reality of it was a shockwave. This was not a polished speech from a presidential podium. This was a voice from the grave, rasping with pain and defiance, accepting death while accusing the shadows. In an instant, the narrative shattered. Elias Vance was no longer a missing politician. He was a symbol, a living martyr broadcasting from hell itself. The calculated grief of Senator Dravos curdled into something that looked, to the entire galaxy, like grotesque opportunism. The question Vance asked echoed in a million conversations, far more powerful than any political argument. Who does benefit from silence? The answer, for anyone who looked at Dravos' swift actions, was terrifyingly clear. The rescue fleet launched not from the Senate's docks, but from a joint task force of minor species, led by Kelvar engineers who refused to wait for permission. They found Vance half-conscious, protecting the inert form of Aiden from the dripping acid. He returned to the Senate not as a man who had been saved, but as a ghost who had chosen to come back. The rescue fleet that pierced Vega Prime's toxic sky was not an official Senate detachment. It was a single, battered Ixian salvage barge, its hull patched with ceramic welds and stubborn hope. The Ixians were a species of void miners and asteroid scavengers, their homeworld a depleted rock, their place in the galactic order firmly at the bottom. Decades before, when an Ixian generation ship suffered a catastrophic reactor failure in a remote system, the only vessel to answer their distress call was a human trade convoy. The humans shared their power, their food, and asked for nothing in return. The debt was never recorded in any Senate ledger, but it was etched into Ixian bone and memory. They heard the president's static-laced transmission and mobilized without a second thought, navigating storms that would shred a military frigate. They found him, pulled him and his silent android from the dissolving wreckage, and gave him the only medicine they had: water reclaimed from cometary ice and a fierce protective loyalty. His return to the Senate spire was not a triumphant procession. It was a silent, grim arrival. While medics tended to his chemical burns, security investigators, now operating on direct presidential authority, followed the forensic trail from the shattered thruster couplings. The path did not lead to a rival political camp or a scheming dynasty. It led into the heart of the institution itself. The molecular corrosive was a proprietary compound, a maintenance fluid used exclusively by the Senate's own Peacekeeper Corps for clearing orbital debris. The access logs for the storage facility were a masterpiece of bureaucratic camouflage, but the digital fingerprints pointed to a covert operations cell within the core logistics division. Further forensic accounting, a deep and terrifying dive into shell corporations and weapons procurement contracts, revealed the funding source. It was a consortium of interstellar armament manufacturers, giants who had supplied both sides of every border skirmish for centuries. Their profits depended not on victory, but on a perpetual, manageable state of fear, a Cold War economy where every species felt just insecure enough to keep buying. They had not tried to kill a president over politics. They had tried to assassinate a peacemaker over market share. Elias Vance walked back into the Grand Chamber not as a victim, but as a prosecutor. The burns on his face were still healing, his movements stiff with pain. He did not take his podium. He walked slowly to the very center of the floor, the eyes of the galaxy upon him. In his hand, he held a single object retrieved from the Vega Prime wreckage. It was a peacekeeper insignia, the polished cobalt blue emblem now blackened and twisted from heat, one corner melted into a grotesque shape. He raised it high, letting the light glint off its ruined surface. His voice, when it came, was quiet, yet it carried to every tear. "You searched for an enemy in the Verex, in the shadows, in the unknown," he began. "The sabotage on my shuttle was not ordered by a foreign empire. It was purchased. The payment was traced to corporate accounts that also fund your campaigns, that sponsor your military academies, that lobby endlessly for larger defense budgets." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the stunned, silent delegates. "The enemy is not out there. It is in here. It sits in boardrooms that balance ledgers against lives. It is the commerce of fear. You have all been customers. You buy their weapons to feel safe from the threats they help perpetuate." He turned the charred insignia slowly. This was worn by a peacekeeper, a guardian, someone sworn to protect this chamber and the people it represents. And they were turned into a weapon against you, against the very idea of a future where their product is obsolete. He let the silence stretch thick and suffocating. "Will you continue to buy from them?" The question was not an accusation. It was an invitation to a terrible, clarifying choice. The revelation was a detonation in the political bedrock. Senator Dravos and the old guard were paralyzed, their moral authority incinerated. How could they condemn an external threat when the corruption was woven into the fabric of their own security? The opposition faction shattered. Some delegates, their careers quietly funded by the same consortiums, withdrew in shame. Others, genuinely horrified, broke ranks and turned toward Vance with looks of stunned betrayal, not by him but by the system they had served. In that fracture, the reform bloc found its steel. The mid-tier delegates, the Ixians and Kelvar and Herbacks, they were not shocked, they were vindicated. They had always lived with the consequences of this commerce, their worlds treated as buffer zones or testing grounds. Vance had simply given their suspicion a name, a budget, and a burned piece of evidence. The coalition solidified not around a person, but around a principle, the disarmament of fear itself. The battle lines were now irrevocably drawn, but the final campaign would not be fought with votes or speeches. It would be fought in the unglamorous, intricate labyrinth of the galactic economy, where the real power had always resided. The charred peacekeeper insignia was not the end of the evidence, but the beginning of a purge. Vance's administration, backed by a newly emboldened coalition, launched a series of brutal, transparent audits into the military-industrial consortiums. Contracts were voided, lobbyists were expelled. For a moment, it seemed the commerce of fear might actually be dismantled. Then the universe itself presented a bill, one that no audit could ever settle. It was called the Tear of Galaran, a shimmering rent in space-time at the heart of the Kalandra Nebula. It began to unravel the delicate quantum filaments that made faster-than-light travel possible through that region. The Kalandra lanes were not just routes, they were the primary economic artery for nearly 40% of interstellar trade. As the tier widened, travel times increased from days to weeks, then to months. The cost of goods skyrocketed, whole systems faced economic collapse. The Senate's Supreme Scientific Council, a body of venerable theorists from a dozen ancient species, delivered their solemn verdict after months of observation. The tear was a natural cosmological event, a tragic but unstoppable act of celestial senescence. The only solution was a century-long, ruinously expensive project to chart new, longer lanes around the nebula, a plan that would bankrupt the very economies it was meant to save. In the midst of this despair, a name began to circulate on the fringe scientific channels. Dr. Aris Thorne was a human astrophysicist, a specialist in catastrophic quantum mechanics. She had made her reputation not in the polished halls of the council, but by saving human colony ships from gravitational shears and collapsing wormhole proxies. She was not a member of any sanctioned body. She was, in the Council's dismissive term, a crisis mechanic. President Vance invited her to address the Emergency Science Summit, offering her services pro bono. The Council delegates, their robes symbols of millennia of academic tradition, watched with barely concealed condescension as the human woman displayed her data. She did not see a natural death, she saw a wound. The tear, she argued, was not senescence but a cascading quantum decay, a chain reaction where collapsing space-time fed on itself. Her proposal was not to chart a detour, it was to perform surgery. She proposed deploying a network of synchronized gravity mines, precisely calibrated to create a countervailing spatial pressure. The goal was not to heal the tear, but to trigger a controlled, total collapse, to snip the fraying thread completely so stable space could reassert itself from the edges. It was, in her words, a tactical amputation to save the patient. The reaction from the council chair, the elderly Volrii physicist Elorin, was a masterpiece of disdain. He did not shout, he sighed, a sound of infinite weariness. "This is not science," he stated, his voice dripping with pity. "It is brutish physics. You propose to beat the fabric of reality until it submits. The variables are infinite, the risks catastrophic. You could accelerate the collapse, swallowing entire systems. We deal in certainty, Doctor, not in violent gambles." The chamber murmured in agreement. The human plan was too messy, too direct, too human. It offended their philosophical commitment to natural order, even if that order meant economic doom. Vance, who had been listening silently from the observation gallery, stood. He did not address the council. He walked to the central podium where Dr. Thorne stood, her jaw set tight. He placed a hand on the console, activating the full chamber address. His face, still marked by the scars from Vega Prime, was grim. "You call it brutish," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner. "We call it a calculated intervention. You have a theory that accepts defeat. She has a plan that offers a chance." He turned his gaze directly to the holographic image of Elorin. "The Kalandra lanes are dissolving now. Your certainty is a path to oblivion, so here is the choice." He took a deep breath, and in that moment he did not speak as a president negotiating. He spoke as a candidate staking everything on a single roll of the dice. "Authorize Dr. Thorne's mission, provide the resources, and we will attempt to save your economy. Or veto it, cling to your pristine theories, and watch as 1,000 worlds drown in the stagnation you call certainty. My continued leadership hinges on this. You decide if this galaxy is a museum to be preserved or a home to be saved." The ultimatum was unimaginable, a president betting his office on a scientific hypothesis. The political shockwave forced a vote that the Scientific Council could not control. The mission was authorized, but with a caveat so severe it was almost a curse. Full operational responsibility and blame would rest with the human team. The preparation was a frenzy conducted under a microscope of galactic doubt. Dr. Thorne's team, a mix of human engineers and a handful of brave, renegade scientists from other species, programmed the gravity mine network. The deployment was a ballet of terrifying precision. One by one, the mines were placed at the fracture points of the tier, their synchronization requiring a level of real-time quantum calculation that pushed their computers to the brink. The moment of activation was broadcast live. Trillions watched as Dr. Thorne gave the final command. There was no grand explosion, no flash of light. The tier of Galaran simply shuddered. Then, like a stressed crystal tapped at its floor, it folded in on itself. The violent, uncontrolled collapse accelerated for one heart-stopping minute, pulling at the light of nearby stars, and then it was gone. In its place was a calm, stable patch of void. The quantum filaments of the Kalandra lanes, no longer being shredded, slowly began to glow back to life. The economic crisis was averted in a single, breathtaking stroke, but the true victory was not in the saved credits, it was in the shattered paradigm. The Supreme Scientific Council was not just wrong, its fundamental philosophy was rendered obsolete. Dr. Aris Thorne had not used brutish force. She had applied a deeper, more intimate understanding of chaos itself. She had looked at a dying star of physics and seen not an end, but a process that could be manipulated. In Saving the Lanes, she proved that human scientific audacity, the willingness to intervene, to get its hands dirty in the quantum foam, was not recklessness. It was a new form of wisdom, one born from the necessity of fixing broken things rather than merely admiring them. Vance's gamble had paid off, transforming a political liability into his greatest testament. Yet for every system celebrating reopened trade routes, there was a powerful institution nursing a profound and humiliated fear. If humanity could fix a hole in the universe, what else might they decide to repair? The calm after the tear was a fragile peace, a quiet before the political storm. Far from the grand marble halls of the Central Senate, in a humidified chamber designed for aquatic species, a different kind of meeting was taking place. It was called the Minor Species Caucus, a polite title for a bloc representing over 60% of the galactic population, yet historically treated as a footnote in the ledgers of power. The Pelagi delegate, her form floating in a tank of nutrient-rich brine, addressed the assembled representatives from agricultural moons, mining consortiums, and fledgling democracies. Her voice, translated through a soft sonic emitter, carried a weight of millennia of patience finally exhausted. The great dynasties, she said, the water around her shimmering with gentle motion, debate the precise shading of the marble in their halls while the foundation beneath us all cracks. They see us as variables in an equation, as resources on a map. The human president, he does not see subjects, he sees partners. He looks at a broken engine and asks for our wrench, not our permission to watch him work. This was not a rally, it was a strategic convocation, a gathering of the weary who had been saved by the cure they did not devise, defended by the truth they did not broadcast, and shown a future beyond the commerce of fear. They drafted a document there in that room, away from the listening posts of the old elite. They called it the Compact of Shared Interest. It was not a pledge of blind loyalty to Elias Vance the man. It was a calculated, collective bet on the principle of disruptive change itself. Each delegate signed with the understanding that their consolidated votes, a sleeping giant of political power, would be directed as a single bloc to secure the presidency for the one force that had proven it could shatter the status quo. This was not an emotional decision, it was cold, hard political calculus. The human had demonstrated efficacy, now they would provide him with the mandate. The leak was inevitable, but its impact was seismic. The details of the compact did not need to be published in full. The mere fact of its existence, the confirmation that the so-called minor species had organized into a coherent, unstoppable voting machine, sent a shock of pure panic through the old elite. Their power had never been about numbers, it had been about division, about ensuring the periphery was too fragmented to challenge the core. That weapon was now broken. In the plush offices of the core world senators, frantic calculations were run and rerun. The math was brutal and inescapable. With the caucus bloc united behind him, Vance's path to a formal, constitutional victory was not just likely, it was numerically guaranteed. The political earthquake was no longer a threat. It was a fact waiting to be recorded by the formal vote. The foundation had not just cracked, a new one had already been poured in secret by the hands of those they had spent 10,000 years overlooking. Senator Dravo stood before the assembled galaxy, a figure of polished silver and cold fury. The minor species compact was a political death sentence, and he knew it. In the face of this new arithmetic of power, he reached back, far back into the oldest, dustiest volumes of galactic law. He invoked the right of challenge. A ceremonial anachronism not used in 10,000 years, it was a formal duel, not of blades but of words and wisdom, to be judged by a conclave of the eldest species. His challenge was accepted, the arena set. The topic he proposed was grandiose and perfectly suited to his strength, the soul of governance. For 3 hours, Dravos spoke. It was a performance of breathtaking classical rhetoric. He wove together epic poetry, historical precedent, and philosophical treatises on cosmic order. He spoke of governance as a sacred trust, a slow, careful cultivation of civilization like tending a celestial garden. He painted Vance's methods as the clumsy, destructive stomping of a child through that garden, ripping up ancient, beautiful flowers to plant quick, ugly weeds. His words were beautiful, hypnotic, a lullaby of lost grandeur. When he finished, a profound, respectful silence filled the chamber. He had not made a political argument. He had performed a funeral dirge for the old galaxy, and it was magnificently sad. All eyes turned to Elias Vance. The president walked to the center of the floor, the scars on his face stark under the lights. He did not begin with poetry. He did not quote philosophers. He simply looked at the panel of elder judges, beings from species whose histories spanned aeons. His voice was quiet, stripped bare. "I have one question for each of you. It is the only question that matters." He turned first to the Volari judge. When the stellar flare threatened your home star, Volarix Prime, and your atmosphere began to boil away, did the perfect procedure save your world? Or was it the frantic, improvised action of your engineers overloading the planetary shields? He turned to the silicate judge from Chorus. When the coraquake shattered your continental plates, did a beautiful debate about tectonic theory stop the lava flows? Or was it the miners who collapsed their own sacred tunnels to divert the magma? He went down the line, naming a crisis from each elder species' hidden history, moments of sheer desperation that their official chronicles often glossed over as triumphs of prepared resilience. The ancient delegates were utterly still, their pride warring with the shock of hearing their own survival spoken of not as destiny, but as desperate, messy struggle. Then Vance gestured, and the central hologram erupted not with words, but with a raw, scrolling data stream. It was a ledger of shame, date stamps, Senate case numbers, and outcomes. A plea from the Herbacks for aid against crop blight, filed and debated for 2 years until famine forced action. A distress signal from a mining colony caught in a gravitic shear, buried in a subcommittee review for 18 months until a human freighter, ignoring regulations, performed the rescue. Line after line, a brutal chronology of the Senate's own inaction, each entry leading to a quantified, preventable loss of life, territory, or hope. The data scrolled in silence, a cold, undeniable indictment. "This," Vance said, his voice cutting through the quiet, "is the soul of your governance. It is a soul that values the elegance of the discussion over the messiness of the result. You have built a cathedral to deliberation on a foundation of ignored screams. The logic was merciless and unassailable. Dravos had spoken of a celestial garden." Vance showed them the real garden, overgrown with the weeds of neglected pleas, watered with the tears of those who waited for permission to survive. The conclave of elders deliberated for less than an hour. Their judgment was not a victory for Vance, but a condemnation of the ideal Dravos represented. The right of challenge was decided in the human president's favor. The consequence was ceremonial but devastating, the formal stripping of Senator Dravos's voice of prerogative, a title of moral authority held by his political lineage for centuries. In that single symbolic blow, Dravos did not just lose an argument. He lost the right to claim his way was the noble one. The moral high ground he had stood upon for so long crumbled into dust, leaving him standing on level, unforgiving earth with everyone else. The path to the presidency was now clear, but the weight of the office had just grown infinitely heavier, for Vance had not just defeated an opponent, he had dismantled a god. The silence after the right of challenge was not peaceful but watchful. The old guard, humiliated and stripped of its moral armor, now waited for the new president to make the one inevitable mistake that would prove them right. The universe, as if obliging, delivered the perfect scenario. They called it the Cyborn Ingress. At the farthest sensor net on the galactic rim, a fleet of 107 vessels simply appeared. No warp signature, no comms hail, no transponder codes. They were sleek, obsidian things, their surfaces flowing with faint internal light like circuitry under skin. Scans revealed them to be fully cybernetic, a hive consciousness of machine and organic fusion. Their weapons, what little could be discerned, were horrifyingly advanced. The military high command, led by General Vorlak, presented the data to the Emergency Council with a single, urgent recommendation: a preemptive, coordinated strike from 3 flanks, using every stealth weapon in the arsenal. The logic was cold and clear: wait for them to power those weapons, and we lose the initiative. We lose everything. The chamber was thick with the scent of fear and the ghost of past invasions. All eyes turned to the president. Elias Vance studied the holographic readouts of the silent armada. He asked a single question: has anyone said hello? The resulting silence was louder than any alarm. A Verex remnant senator scoffed. "Hello, they are a weapon, not a delegation." Vance stood. "Then I will go say it for us." His order was insanity. A single, unarmed diplomatic shuttle, piloted by himself and a minimal crew, would cross the void and dock with the largest Cyborn command vessel. No weapons, no escort, no shields beyond basic meteor deflection. General Vorlak protested violently, calling it a suicide mission that would hand the enemy a galactic leader as a trophy. Vance was unmoved. "If they are conquerors," he stated, "then this show of force changes nothing. They will kill me here or there, but if they are anything else, a single ship without a gun is the only message that matters." The journey to the rim took 2 days. The shuttle, a tiny speck of light, drifted into the shadow of the Cyborn Leviathan. Its hull was a landscape of smooth, dark angles. A portal ear-eyed open, accepting the shuttle into a cavernous, silent hangar. The air was cold, smelling of ozone and something faintly organic like damp soil. Vance stepped out alone. The interior was not a warship's bridge. It was a vast, dim space pulsing with soft, rhythmic light like a sleeping heart. Figures stood waiting, their forms humanoid but crafted from that same flowing obsidian, their eyes points of calm blue light. Their leader approached. No mouth moved, but a voice, synthesized yet imbued with profound weariness, resonated directly in Vance's mind. "You are the leader of the organic collective." It was not a question. Vance nodded. "I am. We come in peace." The Cyborn leader tilted its head, a strangely human gesture of confusion. "Your historical data streams are saturated with conflict. First contact protocols for 94.2% of your species involve kinetic or energy-based hostilities. Statistical probability of our annihilation upon detection was 98.7%. Your vessel carries no weapons. This variable was not calculated." Vance took a slow breath, understanding dawning. "You weren't invading, you were waiting to be attacked." "We are refugees," the voice confirmed, the weariness deepening. "Our dimension collapsed. We are the last. We sought a place to exist. We expected to fight for it." "You offer parley." Inside that alien vault, President Elias Vance did not see weapons or a threat. He saw the exhausted survivors of an apocalypse, hiding behind the only shield they had left, the expectation of violence. He opened a comm channel to the waiting, anxious Senate. His report was succinct. "They are not an armada, they are a lifeboat, and they are asking for sanctuary." The debate that followed was the most tense of his presidency. Fear of the unknown, of the machine, of the other, was a powerful toxin. Vance argued not from strategy, but from the core principle he had fought for. "We have spent centuries building a civilization that chooses," he transmitted to the chamber. "Do we choose the fear your data predicts, or the future our actions can build?" He proposed a solution of stark, simple safety. The Cyborn would be granted temporary settlement rights on Xylos 7, a mineral-rich but biologically dead world, a planet of stone and silence. They would be monitored but autonomous, a trial in good faith. He faced the Cyborn leader once more, delivering the terms. The being listened, its light flickering. "This is a conditional trust," it observed, "a probation for beings you do not understand." Vance met its glowing gaze. "Our history is conflict," he agreed. "But it also includes second chances. This planet, this chance is yours." The Cyborn fleet powered down its weapons arrays, not in surrender but in acceptance. They followed the single shuttle back to the dead world, a procession of silent giants escorted not by warships but by a handful of curious science vessels. Not a single shot was fired. The first contact crisis that should have been a war became something far more revolutionary, a precedent. It was the ultimate testament to the new diplomatic paradigm, proving that the strongest defense is not always a bigger gun, but the courage to offer an open hand into the unknown dark. The old guard watched their final argument, the necessity of preemptive violence rendered hollow. Yet on a dead world, a new question began to stir. What happens when the refugees you save start looking at the garden you've built and wonder if they might tend it too? The dead world of Xylos 7 began to hum with a quiet, ordered industry, but the true reverberations were felt in the heart of the Senate itself. The ancient Lorian president, Telvar, had watched the Cyborn crisis unfold from his crystalline observatory. For 3 centuries, his species had held the presidency, not as leaders but as caretakers, living symbols of continuity and unchanging tradition. He saw the fear in the old guard's eyes, the desperate scramble to classify the refugees as a threat even after they had powered down. He also saw the new coalition, a galaxy holding its breath, waiting for the old system to finally admit what it had become. One morning, without consulting his advisors, Telvar walked into the grand chamber. His movements were slow, each step a whisper of time itself. He did not call for order. The chamber fell silent simply because he had entered. His voice, when he spoke, was like wind over ancient stones carrying the weight of epochs. "I have presided," he began, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the light of 1,000 delegates over an age of splendid stagnation. "We have polished our procedures until they shine, and in their gleam we have mistaken motion for progress. We have built a beautiful, silent museum and called it a civilization." He paused, the admission hanging in the air, more devastating than any accusation. "The galaxy now requires a different kind of steward, not a curator of relics, but a gardener who is not afraid to get his hands in the soil, who understands that growth is not always orderly, and that some weeds are, in fact, new kinds of flowers. I have watched one candidate be tested in the fires we pretend do not exist, fires of necessity, of truth, of simple, stubborn courage. Therefore, I call for a vote of no confidence." In my own administration, the shock was absolute, then profound. It was an act of supreme, self-sacrificing statesmanship. By calling the vote himself, Telvar was not being overthrown. He was voluntarily dissolving the old paradigm, creating a constitutional pathway for the new one to be formally born. He was handing the keys to the museum back to the public and suggesting they might want to build something livable in its place. The vote was not a battle, it was a coronation of the inevitable. When the tally shone across the chamber, the margin was not merely overwhelming. It was unanimous among the minor species bloc and carried by a shocking number of abstentions from the core worlds, who could not bring themselves to oppose the Lorians' final, graceful exit. The special election was set. The campaign that followed was unlike any in galactic history. There were no opponents, not in any meaningful sense. A handful of token candidates from isolationist factions registered, but they were ghosts arguing for a past that had already been dismantled. The question was no longer if Elias Vance would become president, but how the galaxy would choose to define its new era. Would it be a narrow, reluctant acceptance or a thunderous, deliberate mandate? The election became a galactic referendum on its own identity. On agricultural worlds, farmers displayed the human symbol next to their own clan sigils. In orbital docks, engineers painted Vance's campaign motto, "Forward Together," on hulls being repaired with Kelvar ceramics. The Psi-born from their new home transmitted a single, powerful data pulse, a formal endorsement expressed as a complex mathematical proof of stable coexistence. The vote, when it came, was not just a victory, it was a tectonic realignment. The numbers painted a galaxy that had not merely selected a leader, but had consciously chosen a future, turning the page on 10,000 years of cautious history with a collective, decisive hand. Yet in that moment of supreme triumph, the man at the center of it all felt not the weight of the crown, but the terrifying lightness of the blank page that now lay before him. The weight of the blank page was a physical pressure in the quiet of his private office. Elias Vance had won the galaxy, but he had yet to convince his own home. The message from the Terran Accord was not a congratulation. It was a command stamped with the official seal of Earth's unified government and crackling with bureaucratic panic. Their analysis was clear. A human in the galactic presidency would paint a target on the entire species. It would invite resentment, invite retribution. "We cannot bear that risk," the communique stated. "For the safety of humanity, you must formally withdraw your candidacy and endorse a suitable compromise candidate from a neutral species." The order was not a request, it was an ultimatum from the very people he had sworn to represent first. He read the words on the screen, the sterile language of fear. He thought of the Ixian miners who had pulled him from an acid storm, of the Kelvar engineers who had rebuilt a broken world with credits from human colonies, of the silent Psi-born refugees waiting on a dead planet for a sign of welcome. He thought of the charred peacekeeper insignia, a symbol of how far the old rot had spread. To obey the Accord now would be to betray every fragile thread of trust he had spent these brutal months weaving across the stars. It would tell the galaxy that humanity's loyalty was, in the end, a tribal instinct, that they would always circle their wagons when the stakes got high. It would prove every cynical critic right. He did not call his advisors. He did not draft a private reply. He walked directly to the Senate's primary broadcast chamber, the same one from which he had once transmitted a desperate signal from Vega Prime. He activated the galactic feed live with no warning, his face still bearing the faint scars of that ordeal. The signal went out to every world, every ship, every public screen and private device tuned to the news nets. He held up a physical copy of the Accord's order, letting the camera see the official seals. "My own government," he began, his voice calm and terribly clear, "has ordered me to step aside. They believe my service here makes humanity a target. They believe safety lies in stepping back into the shadows, in letting the old rhythms resume. I understand their fear. It is the fear of a parent for a child stepping into a storm." He paused, looking directly into the lens as if speaking to every citizen of Earth. "But I do not serve fear. I serve the idea that brought us to the stars in the first place, the idea that we are stronger together than we are apart. I serve the idea of a unified galaxy, not the short-term politics of one planet." So here is my answer to the Terran Accord and to the galaxy. If the Accord chooses to disavow me, so be it. I will renounce my Earth citizenship before I renounce the promise I made to you. He set the document aside, his gaze unwavering. "My candidacy does not belong to Earth. It never did. It belongs to the Ixian salvager who heard my distress call. It belongs to the Kelvar child who now drinks clean water. It belongs to the Herbax farmer tending regrown fields, and to every being who looked at a broken system and dared to hope for something more. It belongs to every one of you who answered a signal from the dark. I stand with you, or I do not stand at all." The broadcast ended. The silence that followed across a million worlds was not the silence of shock but of profound absorption. Then the reaction broke. On Earth, the Terran Accord was thrown into chaos, its authority publicly flayed by its own most famous son. But across the galaxy, the effect was transformative. The last lingering accusation that Vance was merely a sophisticated agent for human expansion, a tribalist in diplomatic clothing, evaporated in the stark light of his defiance. He had chosen the galaxy over his own tribe at the potential cost of everything. Support did not just hold, it crystallized into something harder and more permanent than admiration. It became a shared identity. Beings who had never agreed on anything now shared a single, powerful sentiment: he is ours. The minor species bloc formalized its compact into a sworn covenant. Even some core world delegates, moved by the sheer, reckless principle of the act, quietly shifted their pledges. The tidal wave of support became a certainty, no longer a political calculation but a galactic fact. Yet in choosing the stars, Vance had severed his tether to Earth and now floated untethered in the vastness of his new office, with all the terrifying freedom and loneliness that implied. The broadcast from Earth had drawn a line in the cosmic dust, but the real campaign was fought far from the gleaming spires. Elias Vance went underground, literally. His shuttle descended through the smoggy atmospheric layers of ecumenopolises, those planet-wide cities, not to the government districts, but to the forgotten lower levels where recycled air tasted of rust and the light was a perpetual, sickly yellow. He walked through the crowded markets of asteroid slums, where entire generations had lived and died without ever feeling planetary gravity. These were the unseen billions, the foundation of galactic civilization whose names never appeared on any Senate roster. They watched him approach not with cheers but with a guarded, weary silence. No official from the central government had ever come here before, unless it was to collect taxes or press gang laborers. Vance did not bring promises of grand aid packages. He stood on a crate in a filtration plant substation and said something utterly revolutionary. "The Senate does not need to give you anything," he told the soot-streaked faces looking up at him. "It needs to get out of your way." He listened for hours to tales of neglect, of how central permits strangled local trade, of how corporate data monopolies charged exorbitant fees for basic star charts and communication, locking entire communities in informational darkness. His response was not legislation drafted light years away. It was immediate, pragmatic action. He called in favors from human engineers, specialists in decentralized network systems developed for frontier colonies. Working alongside local techs, they jury-rigged open-source communication nodes, bypassing the corporate data tolls. For the first time, a slum on Alpha Centauri Prime could access public engineering schematics for free, could form a direct trade pact with a farming commune on a moon in the Sirius system without a bureaucratic intermediary taking a cut. Vance brokered these local pacts himself, acting not as a president but as a facilitator. He connected a water reclamation cooperative in the lower levels with a filter manufacturer from a minor species world, cutting out the corrupt Senate-approved contractor. He showed a mining collective how to form their own legal guild under an obscure but valid charter, granting them the right to negotiate their ore prices directly. He did not solve their problems for them. He handed them the tools and stepped aside. The effect was a political tsunami, but one that built from the ground up. A message would spread from one asteroid belt to the next, passed along the newly freed data channels. The human president fixed our scrubbers. The human president showed us the law they were hiding. He listened. This was not about policy papers. It was about agency, the explosive power of a community solving its own problem for the first time. These unseen billions who had never voted because they were never registered, who were considered a demographic abstraction, began to organize. They used their new networks to launch voter registration drives, navigating Byzantine galactic citizenship codes with a fierce, collective ingenuity. When the final pre-election tallies were reported to the elite in their Spire offices, the numbers were not just favorable to Vance, they were terrifying. The projections showed a voter turnout in previously ignored sectors spiking by thousands of %. The support was not a mild preference, it was a roaring, undeniable mandate from the very ground the elite had built their palaces upon. For the first time, the old powers faced a force they could not lobby, could not intimidate, and could not ignore: the mobilized will of the people they had never seen as people. The election was no longer a contest, it was an inevitability waiting for its ceremonial confirmation. The data streams began as a trickle, then became a river, then a flood that overwhelmed every prediction model. Election day was not a process, it was an event, a galactic heartbeat thrumming through 1 million polling stations. Turnout shattered every record, not by increments but by orders of magnitude. Votes poured in from the lower levels of ecumenopolises, from asteroid belt hab modules, from newly chartered agricultural cooperatives on frontier moons. The numbers painted a picture in light, and it was a landslide of such magnitude it rendered the very concept of opposition obsolete. But as the political analysts stared, their screens awash in victory for Elias Vance, their shock was not at the margin. It was at the map. The support did not radiate from human colonies. It bloomed from everywhere else. It was a victory of the Herbaks and the Kelvar, of the Ixian miners and the Tauran freighters, of the tiny silicate philosophers and the aquatic Palogi. Humanity was not the center of this new galaxy. It was the spark that had ignited it. The coalition was the story, a tapestry of the previously marginalized, now woven together into a single, unstoppable political force with a human as their chosen instrument. In his austere office, Senator Dravos watched the final tally confirm the irreversible. His silver plumage seemed dull in the glow of the screens. He called for a live feed, and when the signal connected him to the entire galaxy, his expression was not one of bitterness, but of a profound, weary understanding. He spoke without notes, his voice stripped of its old rhetorical flourish. "The galaxy has spoken," he said, each word measured and heavy. "It has chosen a catalyst over a curator. It has voted for the storm over the sanctuary. We who believed we were preserving a garden must now accept that the soil itself has demanded a different kind of seed. May history judge us all wisely for what we plant next." He offered a slight, formal bow, and the feed cut. It was not a concession of defeat, but an acknowledgement of a paradigm's end. The curator had left the museum, and the doors were now open to the elements. Across the city, in the modest headquarters that had been a whirlwind of frantic hope for months, a strange quiet settled. The cheers from the staff in the outer rooms were muffled, a distant celebration. Elias Vance stood before the main results board, the cascading numbers reflecting in his eyes. There was no smile of triumph, no raised fist. His face held only a solemn, almost terrifying gravity. The roar of the mandate was deafening, but in this quiet moment, all he could hear was the weight of it settling onto his shoulders. He had asked for their trust, and they had given him not just their votes, but their fragile, desperate hopes, the futures of 1,000 worlds that had been waiting in the wings of history. The campaign was over, the easy part was finished. Now, the real work, the brutal, granular, unglamorous task of turning a revolution into a government, was about to begin. He had united them against what was broken. The far harder task awaited, uniting them to build what must come next. The silence in the Grand Rotunda was a living thing, thick with the weight of 1 million years of history and the breath of a galaxy watching. Elias Vance stood at the center of the vast chamber, the eyes of 10,000 species upon him, but he did not look at the assembled dignitaries in their silks and polished carapaces. His gaze was fixed on the simple date, a crystal resting on the pedestal before him, its core glowing with the light of the Galactic Charter. This was not a coronation. It was a covenant. He placed his hand upon the cool surface, and when he spoke, his voice carried not in the ornate, formal language of his predecessors, but in the clear, direct tones that had first asked a question from the ruins of Vega Prime. "I do solemnly swear," he began, "to defend the possibility of a better future for all sentient beings." The words were a deliberate break, a rejection of the old oaths to uphold systems and traditions. He was swearing to an idea, not an institution, to serve with urgency, to act with compassion, and to never, ever confuse protocol with progress. Each phrase was a hammer strike on the old foundations. Urgency against stagnation, compassion against calculation, progress against the paralyzing worship of procedure. As he spoke the final words, the live holofeed split, carrying two simultaneous images to every screen in the chamber and across the networks. On one side, the solemnity of the rotunda. On the other, the dusty, dead soil of Xylo 7. There, a Cyborn refugee, its obsidian hand surprisingly gentle, placed a single, genetically hardy sapling into the regolith, the first organic life intentionally introduced to that silent world. It was a gesture of trust, of investment in a future they had been granted. The other feed showed the cramped, bustling dock of an Ixian salvage barge. A grizzled Tauran captain, her fur stained with engine grease, was being handed an official seal by a Kelvar envoy, appointing her fleet as a Senate liaison for Rimwood salvage and rescue. Her expression was not one of pride, but of fierce, determined ownership. She was no longer a scavenger in the dark. She was a recognized guardian of it. The symbolism was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. It was a declaration. The era of the curated garden was over. Now the gardeners were everyone. The refugees were planting seeds. The scavengers were being given seals of office. The entire architecture of who mattered, of who built and who tended, was being rewritten in real time. As Vance lowered his hand from the crystal, the light within it seemed to pulse, as if absorbing the new vow. There was no triumphant fanfare. Instead, a low, resonant tone echoed through the rotunda, a sound generated by the chamber itself acknowledging the transfer of authority. It was the sound of a door 10,000 years heavy, swinging open on a new and uncertain dawn. The presidency was no longer a custodial title. It was a mandate for perpetual, compassionate motion. And the man who now held it knew the hardest truth of all, that uniting a galaxy in hope was only the prelude. The far more difficult task was building a tomorrow worthy of that hope, without repeating the failures of a million yesterdays. The echoes of the inauguration's final tone had barely faded when President Vance walked into the Senate chamber to deliver his first formal address. He carried no datapad, no prepared scroll. The words he spoke were not a list of policies, but a declaration of intent, a new operating system for galactic governance. He called it the Vance Doctrine, and its core principle was active vigilance. "We have spent centuries polishing our shields and debating the thickness of our walls," he began, his voice carrying a quiet, relentless energy. "Active vigilance is the understanding that the best defense is not a higher wall, but a longer, clearer view and the courage to act on what you see." Then he made it real. His first executive order disbanded the Peacekeeper Corps Procurement Committee entirely, the very body whose corrupted tendrils had nearly killed him on Vega Prime. In its place, he announced the founding of a Rapid Response Council. Its composition was a revolution in itself. It would be led not by career politicians or generals, but by a coalition of frontier scientists, crisis sociologists, and delegates from the minor species who had lived on the sharp end of every slow-moving disaster. The message was unmistakable. The people who understood the problems would now have the authority to craft the solutions. His second announcement was a project of breathtaking scope. He commissioned a galactic survey to map and catalog quiet zones, stable but resource-poor planetary systems and nebulas that could serve as designated sanctuaries for refugees like the Cyborn. "We will not wait for the next lifeboat to appear on our rim, guns raised in fearful expectation," he stated. "We will have harbors ready with clear protocols for sanctuary and integration." This was the doctrine in practice, turning the lesson of the Cyborn ingress from a lucky precedent into a permanent, systematic kindness. The grand finale was a single, crystallizing sentence that would be replayed across the stars. "We will not be a Senate that reacts," he declared, his gaze sweeping across the silent, powerful boxes where the old guard sat. "We will be a Senate that prepares, that reaches, that builds. Our strength will be our inclusivity, and our speed will be our shield." For a moment, there was only silence, then it erupted. The sound did not come from the senatorial floor. It roared down from the public galleries, packed with Ixian miners, Kelvar engineers, and Herbax farmers who had traveled for weeks to be there. It was a thunder of approval, a physical wave of hope and validation. In the ornate boxes of the old dynasties, however, the silence remained unbroken, a thick, cold pocket of wary calculation. They understood the true threat. Vance was not just changing policies, he was changing the very source of authority, moving it from their closed chambers to the roaring crowd above and the practical minds on his new council. The doctrine was more than a plan. It was a promise that the galaxy would now be run by the people who lived in it, not just those who owned the oldest seats in the room. The first true test arrived not with a political rival, but with a rip in the fabric of reality itself. Mere weeks after the Vance doctrine was proclaimed, a spatial anomaly tore open in the heart of the Corellian system, a region of ancient, settled stars. It was not a clean wormhole or a predictable singularity. Observatories called it the Veil Breach, a ragged wound in space that bled chaotic energies, warping local physics in unpredictable, terrifying waves. Gravity on nearby moons became a suggestion. Light bent into impossible colors. The old guard, watching from their secure enclaves, found their narrative. Senatorial aides whispered in the corridors, their voices laced with grim satisfaction. "You see," they murmured, "this is the cost of his upheaval. He tinkers with the natural order, and the universe itself pushes back. Chaos invites chaos." It was a perfect, poetic condemnation, framing the crisis as a cosmic rebuke. President Vance did not summon the traditional military or the ponderous Science Council. He activated the Rapid Response Council for the first time. The response was not a meeting of dignitaries, but a frenetic, multi-species engineering huddle. Human quantum theorists, their minds trained to think in probabilities and collapsing wave functions, linked directly with cyborn dimensional engineers, whose very existence was proof that reality could be folded and fused. Herbax biostatic experts joined the feed. Their unique understanding of stabilizing complex ecosystems applied to this raging energy storm. They did not debate for weeks. They modeled, argued, and simulated in a continuous 72-hour burst of focused genius. The old solution would have been to muster immense power and force the rift closed, a brute force approach that risked a catastrophic backlash. The Council proposed something radically different. Their analysis showed the breach was not a mistake to be erased, but a new, volatile state of spacetime. Instead of closing it, they designed a resonance lattice, a delicate web of energy fields that would harmonize with the chaotic emissions, not fight them. It was the difference between slamming a wild door shut and carefully fitting it with hinges and a latch. The operation was a ballet of terrifying precision. Cyborn vessels, their hulls resistant to dimensional shear, deployed the lattice nodes. Human pilots, guided by real-time probability algorithms, navigated the gravitational whirlpools to place them. The Herbax monitored the entire system for emergent instability, their sensors tuned to the slightest dangerous fluctuation. When the final node clicked into place, the violent, jagged tear in the veil did not vanish. It softened, its chaotic bleed of energy focused into a stable, pulsing stream. The Rapid Response Council had not solved a crisis, they had harvested it. In his address to a stunned galaxy, President Vance stood before a hologram of the now stabilized breach, a gentle, swirling iris of captured power. "The universe will test us," he said, his voice calm and firm. It is what the universe does. Our duty is not to fear the test, but to answer it with ingenuity. This, he said, gesturing to the luminous rift, was not a breach in our security. It was a door we did not know how to open, and now we have turned the key. The Corellian breach, once a symbol of impending doom, was redesignated the Corellian wellspring, a prototype for a new kind of public energy infrastructure. The old guard's whispers were drowned out by the hum of transformative power. Vance had proven his doctrine in the most dramatic way possible, transforming a cosmic anomaly into a national utility. But if a rift in space could be harnessed, what other entrenched problems might be reimagined not as disasters, but as doors waiting for the right key? The Corellian wellspring hummed with captured power, but the true energy crisis was far older and more entrenched. It lived in the silent, labyrinthine corridors of the Galactic administrative complex, a city within a city run by a caste known as the Grey Eminences. These were not politicians, but the eternal bureaucrats, beings of a dozen long-lived species who had mastered the art of gentle, polite obstruction. For 10,000 years, they had governed the true pace of the galaxy, not with votes but with filing codes, interdepartmental referrals, and the serene, unchallengeable phrase, "The process is underway." A single request for a planetary aid permit could take decades to navigate their Byzantine channels. They were the inertia that Vance's doctrine of active vigilance was designed to obliterate. His approach was not a purge. A purge would have created martyrs and hidden resistance. Instead, he issued an executive order for administrative integration. Its mechanism was deceptively simple and brutally effective. He identified the 100 most critical bureaucratic nexuses, the desks where legislation went to stagnate and urgent requests faded into the archival mist. To each of these senior Grey Eminences, he assigned a new, permanent deputy. These deputies were not from traditional administrative schools. They were young, aggressive aides recruited from 100 different species, from fiery Tauran logistics coordinators to lightning-fast Ixian data runners, from Kelvar engineers who thought in solutions, not procedures, to even a freshly integrated Cyborn logic specialist. They were paired not by choice but by mandate into forced collaboration cells. The culture clash was instant and volcanic. An ancient Volarii archivist, her carapace the color of old parchment, would calmly explain the 73-step verification process for declassifying a stellar survey. Her new human deputy, a former field researcher, would stare in disbelief and ask why. The answer, because it is the process, was no longer sufficient. The deputies, armed with new mandates for transparency and speed, began to hack the bureaucracy from the inside. They built parallel digital tracking systems that exposed bottlenecks. They used cross-species networking to find shortcuts that respected the law but ignored 10 millennia of pointless custom. They asked the forbidden question over and over, what is this actually for? Productivity did not just improve, it exploded. Legislative packages that once languished for years were processed in months. Aid requests were routed and fulfilled in weeks. The change was measured, and the metrics were staggering, a 300% increase in administrative throughput across key sectors. The system had not been broken, it had been jump-started. The culmination came when Vance paid a visit to the master of the Galactic Archives, a being so old its species was forgotten, its form housed within a hovering life support capsule woven with living data vines. The archive was the deepest repository of the Grey Eminence ethos. The master's voice emerged as a soft, synthesized whisper from another age. "You have not broken the system, President Vance," it observed, the data vines around its capsule twitching faintly. "You have introduced a catalyst. It is unsettlingly efficient." Vance looked out over the vast hall where young aides now worked alongside ancient archivists, their tablets glowing next to millennia-old crystal data slates. A faint, genuine smile touched his lips. "Progress often is," he replied, his tone respectful but firm. "Get used to it. it was more than an order, it was a pronouncement of a new reality. The Cultural Revolution was not happening in the Senate chamber with grand speeches, but here, in the quiet rustle of data and the frustrated, then astonished, conversations between the old galaxy and the new. He had turned the very engine of stagnation into a furnace of innovation, proving that the most resilient walls are not shattered by force, but quietly dismantled by a new generation invited inside. The grey eminences were learning efficiency when the message arrived from the one place no one expected. It was not a declaration of war, but a request for a summit. The new Verex Empress, having orchestrated a swift and silent coup against the old emperor, transmitted her communique on open channels. Her voice held none of the guttural bluster of her predecessor. It was cool, analytical, and carried a startling admission. She requested a formal diplomatic conference, citing the principles of the Vance doctrine itself as the reason. "You have demonstrated that stability can be built on transparency and proactive engagement," she stated. "That is a form of power my people must now learn." "We propose a mutual defense pact," the galaxy froze. The Verex Armada, the eternal specter of conquest, was asking for an alliance. In the Senate, the reaction was a storm of disbelief and deep-seated suspicion. This was a trick, a trap, a ploy to lull them into lowering their guard. The old guard, still reeling from their bureaucratic defeat, found a new angle of attack. They accused Vance of naivety, of walking into a viper's nest with his hand outstretched. President Vance listened to the warnings, then called for the summit to be held on neutral ground, the refurbished orbital station above the Corellian wellspring. When the Verex flagship docked, it was not the dagger-shaped Imperator's wrath, but a sleek, unarmed diplomatic cruiser. The Empress herself disembarked. She was tall, her carapace a deep, polished cobalt instead of battle-scarred black, her movements precise and devoid of theatrical threat. The meeting was broadcast live. The Empress looked across the table at Vance. The human who had broken her empires will not with a fleet, but with an open microphone. "You defeated us," she began, the words seeming to cost her something. "But not with superior firepower. You defeated us with a truth that turned our own soldiers against our orders. You defeated us with a moral calculus we did not possess. That is a power we must now understand. My people are tired of being the galaxy's nightmare. We wish to be its guardian." Vance studied her, his expression unreadable. He had expected many things, but not this stark, pragmatic surrender to a better idea. He nodded slowly. "A mutual defense pact is possible," he said, his voice carrying across the silent station. "But defense must be mutual. It cannot be built on the occupation of others. Therefore, our agreement is conditional." He laid out the terms not as a victor dictating to the vanquished, but as a partner stating a necessary foundation for trust. The Verex Empire would begin a phased, verifiable demilitarization of all zones conquered in the last 3 centuries. Their vast standing armada would be reduced by half, with the resources diverted to civilian infrastructure and joint peacekeeping fleets. In return, they would receive guaranteed security under the new Galactic Pact and full access to the economic and scientific cooperatives. The old guard in the Senate watched, aghast, as Vance negotiated not for tribute but for transformation. The Empress did not rage. She conferred quietly with her advisors, then turned back. "The territories will be expensive to relinquish. They provide strategic depth," she argued, falling back on the old language of militarism. Vance met her gaze. "Strategic depth against whom?" he asked simply. "If you are inside the pact, your depth is the entirety of the galaxy standing with you. The only thing those occupied zones defend you from now is the chance to be something else." The silence that followed was profound. It was the sound of a 1,000-year-old strategic doctrine hitting a wall of irrefutable logic. After a long moment, the Empress inclined her head, a gesture of concession. "The demilitarization will proceed," she agreed, "under joint supervision. The image that flashed across the galactic networks was one for the history archives, the Verex Empress and the human president shaking hands, not over a treaty of surrender, but over a blueprint for a shared future. The galaxy's oldest foe was not being punished, but being offered a path back in, provided they dismantled the very machinery of their tyranny. It was the ultimate validation of radical diplomacy. Vance had proven that the strongest peace is not one enforced by the victor, but one that convinces the former enemy to voluntarily dismantle their own walls. Yet in offering the Verex a seat at the table, he had invited the wolf into the garden, and now the entire galaxy would have to learn to trust that its teeth had been pulled. The alliance with the Verex was a strategic triumph, but it left a profound, unspoken void in the galactic spirit. For millennia, the great powers had defined themselves by what they owned, what they conquered, or what they feared losing. President Vance offered them something else to build, something to cherish. He called it the Sentient Archive. The announcement was made not from the Senate floor, but from the hushed, vaulted halls of the Galactic Library itself. He stood beside a holographic representation of a fragile, crystalline memory stave from a species that had blinked out of existence 5 centuries prior, its language still only half decoded. "We have spent eons building monuments to our power," he began, his voice echoing softly among the endless shelves. "Fleets, palaces, economic zones. But the first thing any conqueror does, the first thing any crisis destroys, is not a warship. It is a library, it is a song, it is the story of a people." He turned, and the hologram shifted to display a real-time map of the galaxy, pulsing with thousands of points of light. Each point represented a species, a culture, a unique way of seeing the universe. Many of those lights, especially among the minor species and the Verex's former client states, were flickering, threatened by cultural assimilation, economic homogenization, or the simple, slow erosion of time. The Sentient Archive, Vance declared, would be our answer. It would be a living, digital repository, a project to preserve not just the great epics and scientific triumphs, but the everyday stories, the recipes, the children's tales, the artistic expressions of every sentient culture that wished to contribute. It would be a galaxy remembering itself. Then he revealed the funding mechanism, a masterstroke of poetic justice. The archive would be financed by a permanent, fractional tariff on all interstellar weapons contracts and military procurement, a tax levied directly on the corporate consortiums that had profited from the commerce of fear. The war profiteers would now fund the preservation of everything their products had historically threatened to erase. "A galaxy that only looks forward forgets," Vance said, the words settling with the weight of a universal truth. "And a species that forgets repeats its darkest hours. We will remember together." The political effect was immediate and profound. For the old guard, it was an unassailable proposition, a noble cause that cost them nothing but a fraction of their weapons' dividends. For the minor species, it was a lifeline. Delegates from worlds with no fleet, no great wealth, but with 10,000 years of oral history and intricate art forms wept openly in the chamber. For the first time, their greatest treasure, their identity, was being valued as essential to the galaxy's health. The Verex Empress, in a stunning move, was the first major power to pledge her empire's full participation. She committed the Verex's extensive historical records, not just of their conquests, but of their philosophy, their poetry from before the militaristic turn, their lost culinary arts. It was an act of stunning vulnerability, an offering of their cultural soul to the very galaxy they had once sought to dominate. The project became a galaxy-wide undertaking. Ixian miners helped build the secure server farms in asteroid cores. Kelvar artisans designed the interactive data crystals that could be experienced through multiple senses. Cyborn logicians created the impossibly complex translation matrices to bridge conceptual gaps between entirely different modes of thought. A Herbax elder might share the song used to coax growth from stubborn soil. and a being from a gas giant light years away, experiencing it through the archive, might understand it as a theorem of atmospheric pressure harmony. The sentient archive did more than preserve history, it created a new, shared present. It gave a Tauran freighter captain drifting through the void a connection to the home culture she had left behind. It gave a young human student insight into the Verek's concept of Drakful, not just honor but the weight of consequence carried across generations, fostering an understanding no peace treaty could provide. The deep, existential fear of loss that had once fueled political paralysis, the fear of being forgotten, of being rendered irrelevant, was being systematically disarmed. Your story matters, the archive whispered to every citizen of the galaxy. You are part of the whole, in building a monument not to a king or a battle, but to the collective memory of all who lived. Vance had finally given the galaxy a common purpose that transcended politics. He had given them a shared soul, and in that act of collective remembrance they began, for the first time, to truly envision a shared future. The air in the Senate atrium was cool and still, holding its breath. One standard year to the day after the inauguration, the ambassadors gathered not for a policy address but for an unveiling. The great dome above them, usually showing a serene starfield, was dark. Then, with a soft chime that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere, the mosaic of voices bloomed into existence. It was not a static image. It was a living, breathing constellation of light and sound, a three-dimensional hologram that filled the entire cavernous space. At its core was a brilliant, pulsing nexus representing the Galactic Charter. Radiating from it were millions, no, billions of shimmering threads of light, each a different hue, each thrumming with a unique, gentle frequency. These were the data streams from the sentient archive. As the delegates watched, mesmerized, points of light along these threads would swell and glow. A soft, melodic chant would briefly rise, a herbax planting song from a newly terraformed moon. The light would pulse, and the thread would connect to another, as the song's harmonic structure was visually linked to a Verek's architectural schematic for resonant foundations. Elsewhere, a fragment of an Ixian epic poem about a lost comet would flash, its thread intertwining with a Tauran navigational star map from the same epoch, revealing a forgotten trade route. The mosaic was endless, beautiful, and profoundly complicated. It was not a map of political borders or military alliances. It was a map of meaning, of shared experience, of cause and effect across species and millennia. It visualized the galaxy not as a collection of territories, but as a single, vast, interconnected conversation that had been whispering to itself for ages, unheard. President Elias Vance stood at the edge of this luminous web, his face illuminated by its gentle glow. He did not gesture to the grand chamber around them or to the podium of power. He simply looked up into the swirling tapestry of shared existence. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, almost reverent. "This," he said, "is your true government. Not me, not these chambers, this endless, beautiful, complicated conversation. My role was never to lead it. My role was merely to turn up the volume." The statement hung in the air, a final, elegant answer to the question that had echoed since his nomination. Why a human? Why did the galaxy need a president from a species so young, so scarred by its own violent adolescence? The mosaic of voices provided the answer, not in words but in light. Humanity's entire history was a brutal, accelerated tutorial in consequence. We did not have the luxury of 10,000 years of stable peace to slowly refine our philosophies. We were forced to learn, in mere centuries, the catastrophic cost of division, the fragile miracle of cooperation, the absolute necessity of looking at a broken system and asking why before it was too late. Our trauma forged in us a unique and urgent skill, the ability to diagnose societal paralysis and administer a shock to the system. The galaxy was not a broken machine. It was a stalled engine, its gears frozen by the rust of tradition and the cold fear of change. It needed a spark. It needed an accelerant. Humanity, with our messy, passionate, impatient history, was that chemical catalyst. We did not come to build a human empire atop the old one. We came to restart the engine, to reintroduce the friction of new ideas, the heat of urgent action, and the oxygen of transparency, so the whole vast, beautiful machine could fire again under its own power. The mosaic shimmered, a Verex child's drawing of a three-sunned sky connecting to a Cyborn meditation on triadic stability. The conversation continued, louder now, for all to hear and finally to join. The human president had not come to rule the conversation. He had simply repaired the microphone, and now the galaxy was learning the profound power of its own united voice. The mosaic of voices continued its silent symphony above the Capitol, but President Elias Vance had stepped away from its glow. He stood on a private balcony high on the presidential spire, the night air cool against his skin, still marked by the faint scars of Vega Prime. Below him, the city was a river of light and motion, 1,000 different forms of life flowing through streets designed for 100 different kinds of feet, wheels, and gliding membranes. The sound was a distant, comforting hum of commerce and conversation, the sound of a galaxy no longer holding its breath. The door behind him whispered open, and a familiar, precise footfall approached. It was Aiden, the android aide. His chassis was fully repaired, but a single, deliberate scar of mismatched plating remained on his left leg, a testament to the acid storms and the jury-rigged transmitter that had saved a presidency. His optical sensors glowed with a soft, steady light as he joined Vance at the railing. For a long moment, they watched the city together in silence. Then Aiden spoke, his synthesized voice carrying a question that had likely been processing in his logic cores for months. Do you believe they understand why now? He asked, the words clear in the quiet air. The foundational data is clear, but the emotional calculus remains. Why a human? Vance didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on a scene in a public innovation plaza far below. A cluster of young beings had gathered around a holographic work table, its light painting their faces in shifting colors. There was a Cyborn, its obsidian fingers manipulating energy schematics with fluid grace. Next to it, an Ixian miner's child, her protective goggles pushed up on her forehead, was gesturing excitedly at a mineral analysis readout. A human student was sketching a structural interface, while a young Verex, its carapace still soft with youth, offered sharp, tactical insights on deployment logistics. They were not debating philosophy or history. They were building something new, their arguments passionate, their laughter ringing up through the tower canyons. A slow, genuine smile touched Vance's lips, one that held no triumph, only a deep, quiet satisfaction. They don't need to understand the why, he said finally, his voice barely above the city's murmur. Look at them, they are too busy building the what comes next. He turned his head slightly toward Aiden. The presidency, this entire office, was never an end. It was a means, a single, stubborn tool to unlock a galaxy's own latent potential. Our part, humanity's part, was just to be the key that fit a rusted lock. He looked back at the collaborating youths, their project taking shimmering shape in the night air. The door is open now, the mechanism is turning on its own. The story of the Galactic Senate and its human president does not end on a throne, or with a statue, or in the frozen perfection of a historical archive. It closes here, on this quiet balcony, on the threshold of everything that follows. The weight of 10,000 years of cautious tradition has been lifted. The future is no longer a distant, debated concept, carefully managed by a select few in a silent chamber. It is a living, breathing, wonderfully chaotic project being assembled by countless hands in a well-lit plaza below. It is finally, irrevocably in motion, and for the first time in recorded history, the entire galaxy is leaning forward, not to hear a decree from above, but to see what they themselves will choose to build together.